I was flipping back through Donna Haraway's A Cyborg Manifesto recently, and I was reminded of how much antipathy she has for woman as a political category in that essay. It's a sign of the times for sure. She's writing in the early 80s, reacting against the thing we've been taught to call cultural feminism, though I'm skeptical of that taxonomy. The cyborg, as a new myth, is intended as a way out of women, out of the universalism of the 70s, and potentially out of gender, period. The cyborg is a creature in a post-gender world. And of course, Sandy Stone was Haraway's student at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and Haraway's influence is all over The Empire Strikes Back, which Stone explicitly acknowledges. A Cyborg Manifesto will actually make it into the Transgender Studies reader in 2006, despite trans people playing no role in the essay. I agree with everything you've already said about Stone's essay. I, too, harbor great ambivalence here. I note the connection between Stone and Haraway just to say that post-transsexual is not just an attempt to disavow transsexuality, it's also an attempt, like cyborg before it, to be post-woman. The claim is right there in her citation of gender trouble. Just as for Butler, butch femme cultures both recall and displace heterosexuality, so for Stone, the transsexual both recalls and displaces womanhood. In the transsexual as a text, we may find the potential to map the refigured body onto conventional gender discourse and thereby disrupt it, to take advantage of the dissonances created by such a juxtaposition to fragment and reconstitute the elements of gender in new and unexpected geometries. This is a very 90s move. Nothing could be more 90s than finding a figure that reveals the inner workings of gender. I point this out because this suggests to me that what's happening in that essay is not appearances to the contrary, that Stone is telling some authentic truth about the way it really feels to be transsexual, as she claims. What's happening is that Stone is, like most scholars of gender in the 90s, and the aughts, and our own decade, molding her object to fit her theory, which is not by coincidence the same as the then fashionable theory. In other words, the basic narratological form of the medical discourse, what Stone calls a plausible history, has in fact remained largely intact. All Stone's done is switch out the original content of that history, disease, diagnosis, cure, for a different content, namely the prevailing elements of gender theory in the 90s, performativity, disruption, transgression. In fact, she's laying the groundwork for the long-standing intellectual move in which the trans person, just through the act of existing, becomes a kind of living incubator for other people's theories of gender. Jay Prosser warned us about this in the late 90s. No one listened. EHD. This connection between the post-transsexual and the cyborg is an important one. The cyborg comes to be a stand-in figure for futurity, flexibility, tech gender, hypermodernity, etc. And because the cyborg is essentially the post-transsexual, the transsexual is then relegated to the past. She is archaic and anachronistic. It's quite interesting how the exact same medical procedures and technologies that have been utilized by the transsexual take on a completely new set of meanings in their post-transsexual rebranding as gender confirmation surgery. In the same vein of things people warned us about that we didn't listen to, I think we can turn to Nikki Sullivan's essay Transmogrification, in which she warns against hierarchies of body modification. Not only do these hierarchies of moral judgments about good and bad types of body modification exist in dominant culture, they also take their own form in counter or subcultures. Specifically, what I find to be key about Sullivan's argument is her critique of the idea that some types of body modification are made to reflect free will, critical thinking, and subversive politics, while other types of body modification are made to symbolize indoctrination, false consciousness, and the status quo. Despite the fact that Sullivan's essay did make it into the first Transgender Studies reader, it seems most folks might have skipped that chapter. Sullivan didn't make the short list of texts that get cited ad nauseum in trans studies. Moral judgments about body modification run rampant in queer and trans studies, all in the name of anti-normativity politics. It's really sort of incredible to me, the vitriol that queer theorists have for phalloplasty. If your body modification looks too much like the original transsexual medical genre, your queer cred is toast. So I guess that is something I'm bitter about, the way the transsexual body is the battleground for politics. And it isn't just politics, it's also how body modification is taken up in theory. How can the exact same procedures sometimes symbolize, for queer theory, the ghost of genders past, and other times be the very foundation for new materialist theories of mutability, becoming, and enmeshment? ALC, I'm very glad you bring up the new materialisms. For the purposes of this dialogue, I'll be agnostic about the new materialisms as a general trend. Like all academic trends, some of it is good, more of it is bad, and most of it is boring. But I will say, without reservations, that the new materialisms represent the worst possible direction for trans studies to go in. In trans studies, which is so poor in theory to begin with, new materialist style work somehow manages to take up a disproportionate amount of space while also, quite frankly, not making a lick of sense. That's always a scary claim to make in the humanities. The risk is always that one, having failed to comprehend the argument, is imputing that failure to the argument itself. The fallout is that we are very bad at calling bullshit, but bullshit there is. Do I dare to give you an example? Sure. Take a 2015 article by Karen Barad published in GLQ. In this article, she assures us that she is not taking up trans in an appropriative embrace of the latest theory trends. Then she writes things like this: Matter is a wild exploration of trans animacy, self-experimentations, self-recreations, not in an auto-poetic mode, but on the contrary, in a radical undoing of self, of individualism. Ever lively, never identical with itself, it is uncountably multiple, mutable. Matter is not merely being, but its ongoing undoing. Nature is agential transmateriality, trans-matter reality, in its ongoing reconfiguring. Trans is doing zero theoretical work in this essay. It is employed here purely as an au courant garnish on the same argument Barad has been making for years. I can prove this to you easily. Here's Barad in Differences in 2012 doing her thing. Every level of touch, then, is itself touched by all possible others. Hence, self-touching is an encounter with the infinite alterity of the self. Matter is an unfolding, an involution. It cannot help touching itself, and in this self-touching it comes in contact with the infinite alterity that it is. Polymorphous perversity raised to an infinite power. Talk about a queer intimacy. Now here she is making the exact same claim. She's straight up recycling sentences, which she admits to in the notes, in 2015. Every level of touch, then, is itself touched by all possible others. Particle self-interactions entail particle transitions from one kind to another in a radical undoing of kinds, queer transformations. Hence, self-touching is an encounter with the infinite alterity of the self. Matter is an unfolding, an involution. It cannot help touching itself, and in this self-touching it comes in contact with the infinite alterity that it is. Polymorphous perversity raised to an infinite power. Talk about a queer trans intimacy. Well, which is it, Karen? Is matter queer or is matter trans? Both, of course, because for her, like for most people who claim to be working in trans studies, queer and trans are obviously synonyms. If I sound angry about this, good, I am. But let's try to be nice trannies for a second. What works give you cheer these days? EHD. I am excited about Kyla Schiller's new book, The Biopolitics of Feeling, for the ways it pushes back on some of these theories of reconfiguring and undoing that you and I both find so maddening. Through a history of science, she argues that impressions and impressionability, the ability to affect and be affected, are baked into the very structure of biopower and therefore the modern concepts of race, sex, and species. Contemporary frameworks that seek to contest biological determinisms with flexible materiality do not escape the political legacies of liberal humanism. Rather, they unwittingly recapitulate the conceptual apparatus of the biopolitics of feeling. I am interested in the implications of what she is saying as it relates to trans theory, specifically the ways in which trans as both a prefix and verb has been used as a theoretical shortcut out of fixed binaries of the human. Scheller's argument is that plasticity was actually at the very core of racial science, biology, and heredity. The ability to be affected, to change and adapt and enmesh with one's environment, was actually seen as a marker of civilization. In this framework, transing, i.e. boundary crossing, loses its purchase on radical politics. ALC. As I've said, I can't abide transing. Verbing does not a theory make. But if we had to hang on to it, transing should be a methodology that would start from the premise that everyone's gender is a political disaster and refuse to fix it. I'm inspired here by Marissa Brostoff's recent essay on Caitlyn Jenner and differences, easily one of the best pieces of trans studies scholarship I've read in a long time, maybe ever. The claim is basically that Jenner is unwittingly engaged in a camp performance whose object is queer politics itself. Just as the drag queen once revealed the fragile conventions of gender for Butler, so Caitlyn Jenner, with her timid, half-assed attempts at trans activism in her short-lived reality series I Am Kate, now reveals the fragile conventions of the political as such. It's a beautiful essay and a shrewd argument. I want more work like this, work that refuses both the pomp of anti-normativity and the circumstance of the post-human for something slower, smaller, more tuned into the ways in which ordinary life fails to measure up to the political analyses we thrust upon it. Of course, at some point, that line of thinking takes you out of the academy altogether. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. We've joked, in planning this dialogue, that if we really wanted to append the pieties of the field, we'd ditch the topic we selected and just speak candidly about our lives as transsexuals, the way we might talk over dinner or text message. Of course, we can't do that, not just out of academic decorousness, but because the pages of TSQ would catch fire before letting readers read something truthful about what being trans actually feels like. I exaggerate, a little.